Now, things that should be mentioned before we start this crash course is that my interface is going to look a little bit different than yours. That's why I'm going to give you all some of the default hotkeys and stuff. But generally speaking, what you need to know is that, well, let's just start kind of, this is the viewport, right? We're going to talk navigation. So initially, if you're using a mouse, middle mouse button is your pan. You can scroll to zoom, and I'll probably end up giving you guys this file too. I'll chop it down and give you guys something to kind of like a kickoff file, so to speak. Pan, zoom to scroll. If you're not using a mouse or if you don't have a scroll wheel, I use a Wacom pen, and so I need to use Control Alt and middle mouse, and that's kind of like it's like a precision zoom. It's a little smoother. If you use the scroll, it jumps, right? Clicks. So I use Control and Alt and my just floating out in space. What is that? Get rid of that. Mouse floating out in space. Precision zoom mode helps. Zoom extents is your frame. Some other programs call it framing, and so if you hit zoom extents in the case of 3ds Max, it's going to frame everything that you have. If you have something selected, so if I grab like the navigation section over here and I say zoom extents with Z, it's going to frame that for me. F3 is to go into a wireframe mode. It's important to note that that means like wireframe mode is like a see-through option almost. It's like to kind of just get the raw information of your world. Usually not super helpful. I just don't use wireframe mode a lot. What I do use is edge mode, and so you can hit like F4, and that will show you your wireframe, but it'll overlay on your geometry. And so, and if you guys have questions as I'm going through here, lay it on me. But I'm going to try to go over just sort of the bare minimum of how to use 3ds Max. One of the things that is, yeah, it's talked about here. Okay, cool. I think that's, we got rotate or orbit, alt, middle mouse. And so everything in Max kind of drives off of that middle mouse button, right? And so whether you use a Wacom pen, and I'm going to show you guys how I set up my Wacom pen. I've been doing artwork at a computer now for almost like 17 years. And so I've just about blown out my wrist. And, you know, I think 7 years in or so, I just about had carpal tunnel. And I moved toward using a pen 24/7. You know, I surf the net with the pen. I do most everything with a Wacom pen now. It's just healthier on your wrist. It's a little more natural. It allows you to kind of flex and change positions and hold things differently. So it's just easier on your hand. And it takes a little bit of a different approach to working within 3D programs. 3D programs initially weren't meant for a Wacom pen. I'm an artist, and so it makes a lot of sense to me to be using a pen while I'm in Max or while I'm in my 3D software. You kind of have to get used to a different way of selecting, right? Like you can almost nudge things if you're not used to working. Like, you know, when you first start out, you guys might not be able to click very well. So as you click things, you're kind of bumping and sliding things around. So you kind of have to get used to a different way of selecting, a smoother way of selecting. Oftentimes, rather than directly clicking on things, I use the lasso a lot. And so in Max, that would be on your top toolbar. You have this little rectangular selection region. You can click and hold and turn it into a lasso select, right? And so I got this lasso, and so I would often kind of just drag drag a little lasso around the corner of something to select it versus trying to click directly on it and risk bumping it. So my Wacom pen, it has two buttons, and so it can function like a mouse, right? So what I've discovered is comfortable because in Macs everything's driven off of that middle mouse button, right? We have middle mouse button to pan, we have Control Alt middle mouse button to zoom, and then we have Alt middle mouse button to orbit. And so our most used navigation tools are all on that middle mouse button. And so I would recommend putting your bottom button on your pen, if you're going to use a pen in 3D, to a middle mouse button. We set it to middle click. Okay. I think by default, the bottom button is set to right click and the top button is set to like a double click. We want to set that bottom button to, where'd it go? Clicks, middle click, and then set that top button to a right click. And that's how I work in CG. Okay. That right click will bring up a context menu. That's a context sensitive menu. That means depending on what you have selected will kind of change what is in your right click menu. And so often if you are looking for something related to what you're doing, you know, you might be able to select what it is you're working on or whatever piece you're trying to deal with and go into your right click menu, and chances are you might find something relevant to what you're looking for. I mean, oftentimes, you know, what is elsewhere in the user interface can be found within your right click menu. Now these for me are different than you guys. I change up my right click menus, but you by default would have your move, rotate, and scale within your typical right click menu. So zoom extents, you know, lost and out in space, right? And you're like, I don't know where I am. How do I get back, JJ? You can just deselect, make sure you don't have anything selected, and then hit that Z on your keyboard to frame, and it'll frame to where, you know, everything in your scene, and then you can kind of reorient yourself and get back to where you are. Edge highlight mode, F4 on and off to turn your, you know, to view your edges, your topology. Ports. Makes sense. P for perspective, T for top, F for front view, L for left view are the common ones. When y'all get into Macs, you're likely going to have 4 views. To change your viewports, really you could go into this little plus menu that floats. Yeah, people jump back. You can hit this little plus menu that floats in the viewport. I don't know what else to call it. We'll call it the plus menu. Configure viewports. And there's a layout tab within here, and you guys are going to end up being on something like this by default, where you have 4 views, and it might be your typical perspective view. Oh. Your typical perspective view, you might have like a top view. They're all going to be in wireframe mode. Let's close out of, I don't know, might be like front. It's not going to have safe frames on, so we're going to turn that off. We'll talk about safe frames here in a moment when we set up cameras. I'm just kind of trying to get it as close to what you guys are going to have go. This is probably what yours is going to look like, and it'll be in standard mode. So you'll have kind of generic lighting too. You can grab these center viewports. They have little resize handles that you can pull around and try to change the size of your viewports. That is not the hotkey for. Let's change this. Should be G. G for grid. Just turn your grid on and off. Alt W to maximize your viewport. So you're going to have these 4 viewports like this. You can pick any one of them and run Alt W to maximize that view, and it'll kind of take up your full screen. And you just hit Alt W again to get out of that. And that's your maximize viewport button. And it's really, in reality, a lot of that stuff is down here on the very, very bottom. In the very bottom right-hand corner. You ever get lost, don't know how to navigate? See, I'm teaching you guys hotkeys. And if y'all don't like hotkeys, y'all want to complain about hotkeys, I tell you what, get out of the industry, because you almost get made fun of in a studio if you're someone who doesn't, use hotkeys. They're like, man, I can't believe, how did he get this far in the industry and he's still clicking on all the buttons, like it takes so much time. Like, get used to hotkeys. And so, but if you get lost, I know you guys are new to this program, all that stuff's down here in the bottom right-hand corner. You can maximize your viewport. You have a frame that zoom extents, is what they call it in Max. So you have your zoom tool. You have all that stuff down here. I hide that stuff so that I can have more of my viewport, more of my screen space. And then Alt W to maximize that view, because I like to work in one viewport. And then I like to hit these little hotkeys to flip between my views. And so if I need to get to my front view, I'm going to go into my top view, my front view, and then my left, right? My left view. Also worth noting is that there is another viewport menu. If you hit V on your keyboard, it'll bring up a smaller menu. I've moved mine, but it'll basically be this tiny menu that has your different views, and that's just hit through V. So if I'm going to make one here. Over here to the right, we'll call this, change that, say V. Viewport menu. It's a good one to know. Let me know if you guys, as I'm going along, I'm going to repeat myself here. Let me know if y'all have questions. And hopefully, yes, I'm still recording. Good. Organizational tools. Okay. Your hide and unhide for anything in your viewport is in your right-click menu. So if you right-click in your top right quadrant, you're going to have unhide all, hide unselected, hide selection. And so, like, as I finish off these little modules here, right, I'm going to go and select them, my lasso tool, and I would right-click hide selection. And if I ever want to get that back, no, I don't know where it is, you just right-click, unhide all. Okay, those are in the same place for me as they're going to be for you. So the hide and unhide, it's just in your right-click menu, and you'll see all those right there. Grab these. I use a hotkey for that. It's a custom hotkey. But hide, unhide, and hide unselected. Hide unselected is like an isolate. It's kind of like an isolate. It's not really an isolation, but you can select a group of something right? Maybe you want to just work on a couple of pieces, and you can right-click hide unselected, and that would hide everything else. Helpful. Isolate selection. I don't remember what that is by default. I don't remember what the hotkey is that for by default, but that is also in your right-click menu. Right-click. It's near the hide and unhide. These are our organizational tools. So if you kind of want to isolate to work on something, this means like say all of this stuff, I've already hidden a couple of things, and I don't want to have to unhide all necessarily, and I don't want to have to hide unselected, because if I hide unselected, when I want it all back, I have to unhide all, which is going to bring back those things I already hid. And so isolation tool can be helpful for a quick hide, and so I often use isolate to often use isolate, or me real quick. I often use isolate to work on something, okay? And it's not unhide and hide. It's like a temporary visibility kind of thing you can think of. And when you isolate, you're going to get a little this icon on the very bottom toolbar is going to pop up. So if you ever get stuck in isolation mode, on your bottom bar is isolate, and so you can see it activate as you go in and out of isolate mode. Grouping can be really helpful, right? If you have lots of objects, rather than having to select them all every time, to select 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you could just go up to group. So it's a group menu. You go up to group menu and hit group. It's going to ask you to group this. And you would say, okay, we'll call this box group. And you'll know it's a group because the name over on this bar over here, this little dot, and it might not be as big for you, it might be 1 like that, but this whole panel over on the right, you could think of, if I pull it off, called the command panel. This is really where everything's at. Like if you guys are working in 3ds Max, you could just about get to everything and everything you need through this command panel, okay? And so your name, for example, the name for the tool, the name for whatever you have selected is going to be on the command panel. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because you might get stuck on a group thing. Like when you group something, you can't get into its properties. Like if I have an object in 3D, I'm able to get in and edit some of these objects, right? And you can't do this if your group is locked, okay? And we'll talk about unlocking a group, but typically students don't realize that after they've grouped something, they might forget that it's grouped. I often do myself. And so up here, you'll notice that that name is in bold, okay? And no other object in your scene has a bold name like that unless it's grouped, okay? And so there's a little indicator, a lot of subtleties in 3D software that will help you kind of figure out where you're at, what you're doing. And that's one of those little subtleties, is that box, that group will be in bold, the name will be in bold. So that's kind of how you can tell. So I'm going to right click, and it should be, I'm pretty sure it's in your right click menu. If not, it's on the top. You can go group menu, and then you can say ungroup, and that will ungroup something, but that also deletes the group, right? So if we undo that, we have a group, we want to organize things. We want to get back into that group. You could say group and open, and you're going to see I get this little pink box that floats around that, and that's just kind of like an indicator that these group items belong to each other. So if I move an object, you can see how that group box extends, and that little pink box is an open group. That's what it's letting you know that it is. And so after you get into the group and you work on your object, maybe change some things, change the shape of it because that's what you were trying to do, you would select really anything within that group. You could select the cage, that little pink cage, or you could select one of the objects in, and you go back to group and say close group, and that'll kind of keep it like it's one object. It's not really one object, but it's a group of objects. It's your group. So grouping can be very helpful for organization. The layer explorer is really helpful. You can get to the layer or the scene explorer. You use scene explorer. It's in your tools menu. So if you go up to your tools menu, hit scene explorer, you'll get this object over here. And I have a bunch of different layers and things like that over here that are already in existence. You could probably get rid of a bunch of these, empty ones at least. Delete all those. And you have two different modes. Really, the Scene Explorer and the Layer Explorer are the same thing. They're just different views within that window. And so at the bottom of that Explorer window, that Scene Explorer window, I'll shrink this down a little bit. There's a button down here that is kind of like item mode. It sort of shows every object pulled out. And so you just kind of get like a general list of everything. And so you can select things from your Scene Explorer. So I can select things just by clicking on them over here. It's helpful when you name things, so it's not just box upon box, but you know, it's a lot of time, especially when you're making a billion things. So, but that's why grouping and sometimes having this thing to create layers can be super helpful for keeping yourself organized. Okay. Like I have a layer for the organizational module that's right here. Right, and so instead of selecting all these and hiding them manually like that, I can go over to my layer panel, Scene Explorer panel, and turn off that layer that I created, which it's not, oh, there is a different one. So I can hide that right there. Yeah, box group. Let's see. These will be helpful for keeping your stuff organized because we're going to create a bunch of thumbnails within 3D Space. And I'm thinking that you want to be able to put maybe like each one of these thumbnails on their own layer, and maybe some of the collections of objects within these in a group or something like that. And so it might be like your layers, your top level, maybe you have a bunch of different kinds of objects. Maybe you have like 30 boxes making up like a building or something like that. And you could group all of those boxes as the building, and then that group be within a layer. And so just a way to kind of keep your stuff organized in 3D Space. Your typical selection tools, Q is your select mode. If you mash on Q multiple times, that's how you switch between those. You know, I was telling you guys you can switch the lasso tool. But if you mash on Q several times, it'll flip your selection mode. And so that's why it's cycle selection mode. Same for scale. But for the moment, we'll say Q for select. Also on your top bar, it's this little, I don't know, it's the select button up here. But your transform tools are all kind of located up here on the on that main toolbar. So we got select, we got scale, move, rotate, all on that top bar. Also, it'll be in your right-click menu in a default 3ds Max. So if you right-click, you'll see move, rotate, scale in here. To add to your selection. So if you hold Control, you can add things. Hold Alt to subtract from your selection. Spacebar will lock your selection. You really have to be careful of that because it's easy to kind of lean on the spacebar and then you're not sure why. I change it completely, but it's down here on that bottom toolbar. You got a little icon here for highlighting when your selection is locked. And so if you accidentally touch the spacebar tool, it won't let you deselect, it won't let you reselect anything, and it's going to be stuck like you're on the move tool or whatever tool you were on last. And you're like, I don't know why I can't get out of this. And you're hitting on escape, and you're like, JJ, I couldn't figure it out. It's okay. It's, you know, that's every person who gets inside of 3ds Max has hit that spacebar tool at one point or another and been massively confused. And so just note that you can lock your spacebar, you know, you can lock your selection through spacebar. And sometimes you won't even have a selection and you lock it, right? I guess man, it used to be that you could do that. I guess they fixed that. But anyways, just to note, careful of locking your selection. Selection bracket. That is, every object has what they call a bounding box. Okay, every 3D object has a container that it is in, and I believe they changed. Yeah. All right. So here's a sphere, right? In default 3ds Max, when you make an object, you'll probably get one of these little bounding boxes. And it's just the container for the object. That's all it is. Every object in space has a container. To turn those off, it's not J anymore. That's what it was for many, many years. Now it's Shift J, I believe, by default. It's either Shift J or Control J, but it used to be on J. Now I think it's on Control J, and that'll turn off those selection brackets. Hold on. I think it's in mine. And I almost never turn those on. And so it's funny to me. I'm like, how did I just turn that on? Oh yeah, I have it in my menu down here. Oh, I put it on J. Okay, it's on my quad menu J. Right. Yeah, I believe that new hotkey for it is actually Control J. X-ray mode can be helpful. They used to call it X-ray mode. I got see-through mode on here. Alt-X is what it is by default. Okay. A see-through mode or X-ray mode. It's on Alt-X by default. So if you select a bunch of objects, I can do it with everything here. Select everything and then go into see-through mode, and it's going to make everything kind of transparent. And that's really just helpful for, you know, kind of sometimes seeing things can be difficult, just helpful. Good thing to know. Text for see-through mode. Oh, hide all that. Now, the move tool is on W, right? So if you hit the W tool or right click, go to your move tool, or on the top toolbar, move right there, select and move. Our move tool is going to give you what's called a gizmo, right? You ever hear a teacher or me say, select your gizmo, move your gizmo? They are talking about this drag tool, I guess, you know, called a gizmo, right? It's talking about the gizmo. And so for this little demonstration, I actually modeled a gizmo so that we could kind of break it down and talk about it, because there's, like I said, there were subtleties inside of 3D software that you guys don't necessarily understand yet. And some of those subtleties are like when you hover over your gizmo, right? So if I key for, okay, plus and minus on your keyboard to change the gizmo size. But if you hover over your gizmo, it's going to highlight varying axes, right? So if I want to move something, only on the Z-axis, if I only want to pull it straight up, then I have to make sure that when I hover over this, right, you really got to see it highlight. And that's what I'm calling out here. That subtlety is the highlighting of what axis you're dragging on. And so if you are dragging, if you just click on the box and pull the box, it's going to drag on whatever last axis that you highlighted, okay? And so the last one you touch is going to be the one that is going to be pulled on if you don't grab the gizmo, right? So if we hover on maybe X and Y together, you see it's going to highlight, and now I can move it in sort of a flat manner, right? Like I could move it off. Let's try this. Grab the X and Y, I can move it off into space like that. And this is often what happens, like students will be kind of like this, and they want to grab something and move it up, and so they think they're moving it up when really they're pushing it back in space, and it's because they're not grabbing the gizmo correctly. So just be really conscious of where you're pulling things, okay? Like if you really want to pull something up, just make sure that you highlight that Z-axis and the Z-axis only as you pull on this. Rotate tool is the same way. Right, so our rotate tool. So rotate on one axis. Oftentimes you might grab the middle of this box and it's going to rotate on any axis. You don't want to do that. You might accidentally miss. You're trying to grab like the Y, for example, and you miss a little bit and you grab, you know, the center. And if you grab the center, it's going to pull, it's going to rotate in any direction really. So just make sure that when you're working with gizmos, you know how you're transforming the object. You know that you're locked on a particular axis. This very outside axis is to rotate it based on the camera. So if you go on this side of the object and grab that very outside ring here, it's going to rotate it based on the camera. So it's technically rotating it on all three axes. Just be careful that you're not grabbing that outside one. It can kind of do some weird things. Can be helpful if you know what you're doing with it, but just something to be aware of. And the scale tool, okay? Scale tool. Hit R on your keyboard and get that scale tool. Same thing. Just make sure that you're paying attention to what axis that you're pulling on, okay? The scale tool has a few more subtleties. Typically, when we scale, we want to make something bigger, right? We don't want to grab one of these sort of dual handles. So you have that center triangle, which is the one you want to select. This center chunk, right, is what you want to select. And that'll scale everything up together. It'll scale the whole thing evenly. Students often think that they're doing this when they grab this little handle off to the side, right? This little thinner slice of the scale tool. And they might try and pull on that. And it's going to scale up on only two of the axes, right? Like it's leaving the Y alone. And so it's not getting any wider, but it's getting taller and sort of, you know, wider front to front. And so just be careful that, you know, that'll kind of can be helpful. You know, if maybe we don't want to change the height of it, we like how tall it is, but we want to make it wider, you know, could be helpful in that manner. Grabbing a single axis is helpful. Maybe we just want to change the size, you know, the height of something, pull it up on the height like that. Gizmos, okay? Use them wisely. They can be your friend or they can be mega frustrating. So now that we know how to move around, let's talk basic geometry, right? This is almost like selecting things in Photoshop, or it's almost like the brush tool in Photoshop. We're going to do anything, any kind of modeling, any kind of creating in 3D space. Every 3D program is like this. Every program has primitives, okay? Primitives are simple objects, like a box. And you can find that, and I was talking about the command panel previously, so here's that command panel. I'll pull it off. This first little plus button is called the create panel, okay? So the whole thing is called the command panel. The plus is where you create things, okay? So I'm going to hit plus, that plus tab, that create panel tab, and we got the primitive button here. And you got box, sphere, cylinder, torus, teapot, text, cone, geosphere, tube, pyramid, plane. Planes, super helpful. Like flat ground planes. You know, I use planes a lot. But the reason why we should talk about these primitives, there's really just a couple of things that we want to know, right? One is how to create primitives. It's not as simple as just a single click and drag, though you could change it to cube mode and it is a simple drag, right? But by default, when you're making a box, it's on box creation method mode. And when you drag out, your first, still holding drag, right? We're going to pull this out and we set the size, that sort of base length and width. And then when we let go, we're still connected to that box tool. And we have to then set the height and then click again. Okay, and so every primitive has its sort of own way of being created. And so a box is a click, drag, let go of click, drag up, click again. Okay, so I mean, it seems like a silly thing, but you know, this really confuses kids when you start out. It's like, I don't know how to, what's it doing? I don't know. So, sphere, pretty simple. You drag a sphere out, right? Easy. Cylinders, kind of like the box, has a single drag. Click and drag, and then when you let go, you set the height of it. That's something really, really awesome about 3ds Max that's important to note, is that you can just about right-click cancel out of anything. Well, what does he mean by right-click cancel? Anytime you start an operation, you start to click on something, if you hit the right-click button on your mouse, it'll cancel out of that operation. So if I begin to start drawing a box and then I go, that's not at all where I wanted it, I don't have to finish drawing the box. I can right-click and it'll cancel out of that operation and I can start somewhere else, right? And so, good little thing to know. Same for any, you know, like a sphere or a cylinder. If you start a cylinder and you don't like where it landed, you can right-click out of that, cancel the operation. Or it's not, or I guess just a torus, like a little donut. You set the width, or you really set the diameter, the radius of diameter, and then when you let go, you're setting the thickness of it. Teapot, not particularly helpful. That's like a 3ds Max joke. That's like the origins of 3ds Max. It's almost like they're when people think 3ds Max history, they think the teapot, and so it's in there really just for legacy purposes. People don't actually really use the teapot other than just like a demo primitive. Text, super helpful. You can drag a box like you can in Photoshop. You can click drag to set a boundary, or you can just click once and then start typing. We have a little box over here. Start typing stuff. Now, primitives, they all have settings, okay? When we set a primitive, or when we're working with any object, I was talking about that command panel. I'm going to pull it out again to isolate it. That command panel, after I create, say, like a sphere, right? And drag out a sphere. You might think that you can forever control the settings for that underneath, but that's only the initial create settings. After you create any object, if you deselect it, right? I get out of that object, I deselect it. You see that when I go and I highlight that sphere, that those settings aren't there anymore, okay? And to get to these settings, you have to understand another thing about the command panel, because like I was saying, we were in create mode. Now we want to be in modify mode, right? We're going to modify that what we created, and that's really for anything. If you want to get to the settings for anything in your scene, you got to highlight it and then go to that modify tab, okay? And then that'll get you into that object, and you see that we have different settings in here. We can change how many polygons that sphere has. We can go in and change the radius again without having to scale it. You know, little settings for that. Helpful on like the cylinder. So I dock that command panel again, and I go and let's go and create the cylinder. Create a cylinder. It looks low poly or CG, this sort of almost how we can count the sides on it, right? That ability to count the sides, the ability to see the geometry, or how low it looks, they call that faceting. And so if you ever hear me say your objects look faceted, that's what I'm talking about. It looks low, and we can change those settings in that modify tab. We're over to the modify tab, and we can turn up how many sides your cylinder has. Now, we don't need to drag it up to max amounts, but we just want it to be at a certain point where it doesn't look like it's stepped or faceted. Okay. So you can get into those primitives and change some settings and that sort of thing. Questions? All right. So primitives. Now splines. Splines are like the pen tool. Okay, you guys maybe have used the pen tool inside of Photoshop. Splines are just like that. Okay, it's like a path. It's like a curve. It's like the pen tool. And so to create splines, it's also in that create panel. It's near the geometry. It's near that primitive creation, but it's right next to that geometry. And so it's one over, right? It's one little button over from that primitive button. And we got line. So I can draw a line. And then right click cancel to end it, right? When you're drawing splines, you can click and pull to create curves, just like you could on a pen tool. So it's very similar. To close a shape, you have to go back to that very first vertex, the very first little node, and click, and it'll say close the spline, and you say yes. You can close that object. That's important to note because closing objects allows you to later convert it and maybe make a shape out of it, which can be super helpful. So maybe I wanted to draw some things, right? And if I don't close it, when I try to convert that, it's going to disappear. It's going to break. Okay, so just note that when we want to convert a line or a shape or a spline into a silhouette, we need to close that object. And so it doesn't matter what the object is. We go back, click on that last one, say close spline, we say yes, and that'll close that spline in case we want to convert that later and use it for something, for all kinds of stuff. Like you just never know. Maybe you want like all kinds of stuff. We'll get into that. Splines are super helpful. You have different kinds of spline. We have a circle spline. We have an arc. So you set the beginning point and the end point, and then you set how wide of an arc that is. I like Ngons. I use them because it's like the one, it's like the circle tool is not, the Ngon is like a circle tool, but you can set how many sides it has. The circle spline itself is not like that. It's meant to be round, and so it tries its hardest to make a round shape. And to get it down low, you have to really go down in here and mess with some settings that really just change the faceting on it. It's not really counting how many sides. And so to make a very particular amount of sides, I like using the Ngon tool, because an Ngon, if you go under its settings, you can set exactly how many sides you want, whether it's 3 or something like 9, or just you can set it to a particular number. It can be helpful. So Ngon's pretty cool. And really just, that's basically the extent of splines. There are other splines in here. They're not really super helpful. You got like a star. You can change how many points are on the star. I don't know why you need a star. Usually not making star shapes. Helix can be kind of helpful in that it makes sort of this raised spring, right? So if we set sort of, when we're making a helix, we set the thickness of it, or like the diameter of it, and then we set the height of it, and then we're setting the taper of it, right? So if we want like a kind of something to spiral inward, we can set that taper amount. And then under settings, we can change how many turns that it has, or how many coils, right? So if I turn coils up, I'm trying to do those turns up. Right. And now splines aren't visible usually. They're not visible to the camera. They're not visible to renders. And you can give them a thickness. And so under any spline, create any one of these splines, you can go under their settings, under that modify panel, and under the rendering tab, you can say enable in viewport, and then you get a thickness amount, and you can sort of, things with that. It can be helpful, right? If we do like a circle spline, and we say enable in viewport, and we turn that thickness up, it's basically a torus from earlier. Why that's helpful is oftentimes you want to maybe make like wires, or if you have things dangling down from your buildings or something like that, maybe you want these kind of so you could go in here and say set all these to give them a thickness, varying thicknesses. Yeah, splines are nice, especially for what we might be doing. We're creating little silhouette thumbnail kinds of things, and so being able to create like little tendrils or tentacle looking things, splines are super helpful. Lights and cameras. I don't want to get too into lighting. We're going to try to keep things simple. How much more do we have to talk about here? That in a moment. Modifiers are nice. And we can get to modifiers. Another kind of big key feature of 3ds Max, the light modifiers. Now, could be, I mean, they're just different things, right? Like as we create a primitive object, if you want to add a modifier to something, you go over to your modifier panel and there's a modifier list. And you have all these different kind of almost procedural effects that you can apply to geometry. And you know, it's different things. And so like you have, if I create a box and I put like an FFD modifier on it, and you see that this we have the modifier list under the modifier tab, but we also have the modifier stack. Okay, and so every time you add a modifier, it's almost like putting a layer on top, and so you're building a, you know, you keep stacking modifiers, modifier stack. You can also get into some of the settings of the modifiers, and like an FFD box has control points that you can sort of warp objects with, and that can be super helpful, right? You see how I can get some really organic shapes pretty fast without having to really know how to model. You know, like it's good for getting curved shapes. What's cool about the FFD box is that you can change how many control points you have. So if I were to set it to like, if I set it to like, I don't know, like 5 or 6, do a 6 by 6 by 6 on those control points. It gives me more control points to go into that. You know, I have to go into that modifier stack and select control points underneath FFD, but I could go in here and I now have more fidelity for making shapes. Right, and same thing goes if I have less, right? If I want less fidelity, I could change it to like a 2 by 2 by 2. That's just going to give me fewer points to work with. So FFD box is a pretty good modifier, great for kind of warping shapes. Push modifier, if I go up to the list here, I go modifier list, and I can just type on my keyboard, say push, and say enter, and put a push modifier on that. That's just the general, almost like you could think like a thickness of an object. You can push it outward. So push modifiers are cool. Shell modifiers can be helpful to give a thickness to something. So if I like drag a plane out here, you know, planes don't really have a backside. If I drag a plane and put a shell modifier on it, that give it a thickness, and I can set that thickness over in the modifier panel. All right. You guys still with me?
Yep.
Cool.
Yep.
Yeah, we're here.
Cool. And then you got things like twist modifier, bend modifier. Bend modifier is super helpful. Yeah, see? Right? Bend modifier. Turn the direction. Taper modifier. Helpful. Verify modifier. Symmetry modifier, also really nice. So if I do something like a box, and I go modifier list, type in symmetry, set the symmetry axis. And what's cool about the symmetry modifier is if you open that up on that modifier stack, you can actually move the center point, and you can rotate the center point. Turn on multiple axes. So maybe I do something like that, right? And I could totally put another symmetry modifier on it. Maybe I start double stacking these or something. A symmetry modifier on it. And then I open that symmetry modifier and I'll move that center point. And on multiple axes. Really just, I was able to turn a single box into sort of this wild collection through just basically doing a symmetry modifier and flipping it around a few times. So that's super helpful. I'm not ready to, I don't think we should talk about pivots just yet. Clone. This, super helpful. Okay, I want to create, say I have a sphere, and maybe I did something to that sphere. Maybe I put some modifiers on it, you know, like the bend modifier, or maybe I put like a taper modifier on it, right? And I spent time making a shape. You can quickly duplicate something by holding shift on your keyboard and using a transform tool. And when I say transform tool, I'm talking about the move tool, the rotate tool, the scale tool. So if you're holding shift while you do that, I can duplicate it. I say, oh, clone, yep. Hold shift and move it over again. And I can set how many times I want to do that. So maybe I change the number of copies to something like 5. And you see I can duplicate things out. So if I select all of these, and then I hold shift and I move all of those, and I change the number, right? And get some shapes really quick. That's how you quickly clone things. Hold shift. And so that shift drag, that's what we're talking about right here. Shift drag technique. So they will take an object, shift drag it, boom, make copies. This is a really fun thing, right? So say, let's go back to that little shape here. If you clone something and say, okay, these objects are independent of each other, but if I get out of that, hold shift, and then I say instance, well, let's actually just do one of these. I make several copies and I set it to an instance instead of a copy. These are linked now, and so if I change settings on one of them, say like the taper amount, open up, you see they all change. So instancing can be helpful if you want to kind of get back in. Maybe you make a row of something, you know, you're wanting to kind of treat them as a group of something. They're all the same, you know, that'd be a way to go about kind of saving time in the future. Oh, maybe it wasn't the right size, but I don't want to have to reclone them. You know, sometimes instancing things can be super helpful. The array tool, really nice tool. Let's talk about the array tool real quick and bring that back. I kind of almost did an array with that symmetry modifier, but in reality, we go up to Tools, Array. You get this kind of it's kind of an intimidating looking box, but really what we do is we set what we want to do, right? Or set what kind of transform we want. And so if I say rotate, I'm going to activate rotate. So I hit that little arrow right next to rotate. You got to say I'm going to rotate something. And we set sort of that, we got to hit that preview button. So if I hit preview, rotate, it's duplicating based on my count here. So if I set the count to something like 3, I'm changing these rotation amounts. Doesn't really look super helpful right there. Would be a good thing to array. Usually when you array something, the pivot point's off. I know I'm throwing a lot at you guys, but an array can be helpful if you have sort of an offset pivot. Every object has a pivot point. It's like its origin location. It's when you go to a move tool, rotate tool, scale tool. It's that container that we were talking about, right? Every container, every object has a pivot point as well. And so if you have a pivot point where you move a pivot point, that's one more tab over from the modify panel. Go to the hierarchy panel, and we say affect pivot only, and we can place a pivot point kind of off in space for that object, and then turn off affect pivot point only. And now if I do something like a tools, go to tool menu, array, and I activate rotate and hit preview, and then I turn up these rotation amounts. Right, we can do an array, which can be helpful, and we can change how many of those that we want. We could do a 2D array, which can be kind of out of control here. Let's turn that down a little bit. Actually, let's do 2. Oh. Okay, it's an array tool. Can do some cool stuff with the array. And lastly, let's talk about editable poly. All right, so that was kind of a quick crash course on how to deal with, or kind of how to get around in Max and some of the basic modeling tools. What is worth also discussing is how to get in under the hood of an object. Okay. And that's kind of like what this, sort of what the pivot point was about. It's kind of an under the hood thing. But if we create a box, right click on that box, and down at the bottom, you're going to see a convert to. You're going to say right click. You have to have the box highlighted. You have to grab the box. Right click, convert to editable poly. And this is, like I keep saying that, it's the metaphor of opening up the hood, right? This is getting underneath the hood. Editable poly allows us to deal with polygons, edges, and vertices. And so under that modify menu, because that's where we have to be, when we say convert to editable poly, it's going to put us in that modify menu. And it's going to expose these modes over here and a bunch of tools for each mode. Now, this is kind of in depth. We start getting into like talking about modeling here, but you guys might need some of this to be able to go in and change some of the positions of your vertices, right? If I want to make a particular shape, vertices, And so each one of these little modes over here I have to highlight. Well, if I want to move the edge, I can grab the edge and I can move that whole edge. Or if I want to grab a polygon like that, highlight it and pull it, I can do that. Okay. So working with editable poly mode will help you guys get some of your custom shapes. And just about under each one of these modes, they all have their own tools, but what is consistent among them is the cut tool. And so if I go into like vertex mode and I say cut, I can cut shapes and add vertices into something. This is where it gets even wilder. Remember how I was talking about that shift drag technique? It works here too, but in the case of an editable poly, shift dragging polygons. So if I select this object here, I shift drag a polygon. So I'm holding shift and I use the move tool and I pull it. You see I can slice through an object, right? And I can do that with, so if I go cut and say I want like, I don't know, I want like a shape here, right? I'm gonna close that shape and then right click, cancel out of the move tool, or cancel out of that cut tool. And I select that polygon and I hold shift, I can pull it up and extrude it, or I can hold shift and pull it down through it like that. And so we can start getting into custom shapes, okay? Be careful about grabbing polygons like this and just hitting delete. You know, like you guys might leave some kind of remnants of geometry, just something to be, something to look out for. Could also be helpful. You know, I was trying to show you a case where you might use a shell modifier earlier. And so maybe I delete some faces and I have all these kind of open pieces of geometry that are looking kind of weird and not helpful. I might be able to put a shell modifier on it and then add a thickness to that, right? We're going to say outer thickness or inner thickness and then outer thickness. Can be helpful. And that was getting under editable poly, right? So if I create an object, maybe like a cylinder, okay? And I go and I change some of these settings in here and turn the height segments. I mean, maybe I want height segments, maybe I don't. Set it to something like 5, I could turn these sides down. Set it to something like 6. Maybe I set my cap segments to something a little higher. And then I have my cylinder. I would right click, convert to editable poly. And I could go in and select some of these faces. There's even like a grow button over here. I say grow. And if I hold shift, pull that part of the way down, and then got to shrink my selection. And then shift drag up. And then maybe I leave editable poly mode. If you ever want to leave an object, but you're in editable poly mode, you have to make sure that you turn off these modes over here. So if you're in vertice, you can't get out of vertice. So you come over here and you turn it off. And after you turn off whatever under the hood mode you're in, whether it be vertex, edges, or polygons, you know, depending on what mode you're in, you can then get out of the object. So you have to deselect them all though, all right? So you have to turn off those modes and then you can deselect the object and maybe clone it, right? Do a shift drag at an object level. Working in here with polygons are sub objects, okay? So I just select maybe these. JJ's making a tower, right, for like a castle. That's working at a sub-object level, and then you turn off sub-objects, so I have to leave polygon mode, and then I'm at an object level, and I can duplicate the object at an object level like that. And then maybe I rotate it. All right. Now that was a lot. I think we'll call that a. I'm actually going to stop the video. We're going to keep going just a little while longer. I'll talk about the homework, what you guys are going to be doing. But that was more or less a crash course for 3ds Max. I'll stop it so that's a good video for you guys to scrub through. Oh.